This story was sent to us from Luis in Chicago. My wife and I owned and operated a 24-hour laundromat in a rough Chicago neighborhood for several months and quickly closed the business after this experience I'm about to tell you about. The first few months of business were going very well, and we enjoyed the customers who came in on a regular basis. We knew many of the customers by name because, like I said, some of them came in regularly, at least once a week. One day, a new customer came in and there were a few things that were strange about him. The first thing we noticed is that he came in to wash his money. My wife and I couldn't believe this guy would not only wash and dry his money, but that he was doing it publicly. The second thing we noticed about him was that he would pay other customers to let him use a machine they were using at that present time. I mean, this guy would pay people to empty their washing machines in the middle of a wash cycle so he can have the specific machine he wanted. When he left, we would ask the customers why they were so willing to do that, and they would just smile or shrug their shoulders. One day while it was happening, I walked over to intervene and one of the other customers stopped me. He looked concerned. He asked me, "Do you know who that is?" Of course I had no idea. The customer who stopped me began telling me that this guy was a local dealer in the neighborhood, and everyone feared him. He told me that I needed to be very careful about how I approached him. At the time, I was too prideful and felt the need to protect my wife and my business, so I approached him anyway. I walked up to this guy who was much larger than me and I told him that I wouldn't tolerate any intimidation in my place of business. He laughed in my face and told me that I would soon be working for him. I told him not come back to my establishment before he gathered his bags of money and left. Later that night, he returned, this time with two guys who were even larger than him. He walked up to me while the other guys stood on guard at the door. At the time I felt like this was a scene straight out of a gangster movie. My wife picked up the phone to call the cops and the guy said to her, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." I took the phone from my wife's hand and asked him why he was there. He said, "We got off on the wrong foot earlier. I'll cut you some slack though, because I know you are new to the block." He started telling me about how all the other businesses in the neighborhood had to pay what he called street taxes. He explained that the street taxes were the cost of doing business in his neighborhood. I told him that I wouldn't be taking him up on his offer and he laughed. He told me, "This is an offer you don't want to decline. You're better off dealing with me than the boss." I told him that in my place of business, I was the only boss. He laughed and said, "Not for long," and walked out. The next day he showed up again, but this time he wasn't coming to wash his money. He returned with his bodyguards from the day before. He asked me if I had thought about the offer he made me, and said that his boss had an even better offer that would put money in my pocket rather than take money away. He asked me, "You know why I come in here to wash my money?" I had no idea but thought maybe he was a germaphobe. He kept talking, "Because when you have dirty money it's hard to touch clean things. This is the perfect place to clean money if you know what I mean." I assumed he was referring to coming in each day and literally washing and drying his money, so I told him he was no longer welcome to do that and suggested he wash his money at another laundromat. He laughed before explaining to me that cleaning money in my business meant that his money made from the streets would be invested in my business to make it legal. We went back and forth for a few minutes before he left. After that day I kept receiving death threats from a man who claimed he was the boss. He told me I had upset the cartel and they were going to ruin my business if I didn't do what they told me. They even threatened to harm me and my pregnant wife and said they were watching our every move. At first, I didn't believe I was speaking to a cartel boss, but then one day when my wife and I showed up to our laundromat, the entire place was trashed, everything was turned upside down. Our machines had graffiti on them, and they had been overflowing. Each day we would go in, the place would be vandalized even worse than the day before. We would find animal blood smeared on the floors and bathroom mirror. We would find machines broken and bricks thrown through the window. Most of our customers had stopped coming in. Our business was more than 3 months behind on bills by the time my wife and I decided to shut down the business we had spent so many months building. Our final straw was when we would look through our window at home and the same black car parked across the street. My wife kept urging me to call the police, but I knew that could be a dangerous thing to do. Besides a few family members and friends, we never told anyone the real reason why we closed our business.
When I was about 7 years old, my mom and dad planned to come to the United States by walking across the border from Mexico. A few of my dad's friends had done it successfully, and my parents thought it would be worth a try. I remember my father working very hard to save up the money for us to be able to go. My mother, who had always been a housewife, even got a job cleaning houses for wealthy people. It took my parents about 2 years to be able to save up enough money to make our dream of coming to America come true. I remember how excited my family was when we finally had enough money saved up to come here. My father and my mother sat on the floor in our small kitchen and counted the money. I don't remember how much money it was, but I remember it being more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was so much money that it took my parents a few hours to count and recount it. A couple of days later, my parents told my brother and I that our last day at school was the day before. I remember us crying that we didn't get a chance to say goodbye to any of our friends. My father said it was for our own good and that he didn't want us to accidentally tell any of our friends. He said no one outside of our family could know what our plans were. The plan was that our family would be smuggled across the US border with the help of a coyote. A coyote is basically a person who smuggles people across the border. The coyote is pretty much controlled by the cartel. My father told us that we would have to leave most of our belongings behind because we would be walking most of the way. I remember my brother and I crying hysterically at the thought of not being able to bring some of our favorite toys, blankets, etc. Our parents promised that we would get better toys once we arrived in the United States and that our lives would be much better. The next morning, my mom came into our room and sat on the side of the bed that my brother and I shared. She told us it was time to wake up and we needed to hurry up because we needed to make it to a certain point before the sun came up. I remember it still being dark when I woke up. It was about midnight or a little after. While we got dressed, my father was outside with our uncles checking the oil and changing the tires on my uncle's car. My grandmother, who lived right next door, came over as she was praying with us and say goodbye. We got in my uncle's small car and we drove for about 2 hours until we saw the lights from another vehicle flashing. The ride to this point was very bumpy. My father and uncle got out of the car and walked up to the guys who were leaning on the other car. My father and uncle spoke with them for a few minutes and then I saw him hand the guy a stack of money. My father walked back to the car and told us to hurry. My mom, my brother, and I got out of the car and my family walked towards the coyote's pickup truck. In the back of the truck was another family, a man, his wife, and their young daughter who was about the same age as me. My father picked my brother and I up and sat us in the bed of the pickup truck before helping my mother in. He got into the bed last. We said hello to the other family. My father shook the man's hand. We drove for another 2 hours before we arrived at a shabby house off a dirt road. We all hopped out of the truck and walked up to the house at the request of the guys who were guiding us. When we got inside, our bags were searched. The guys told us that we weren't allowed to bring some of the stuff we had with us because they would weigh our bags down too much. They gave us a pair of sunglasses each and told us that we would need them for the trip because the sun would burn our eyes. By the time we were back on the road, our backpacks were so light that they felt empty. We got back in the pickup truck and drove another 30 minutes before getting out. We were handed over to another group of guys who would guide us on the rest of our journey. These guys didn't have a vehicle, which meant that we would be walking. We were told that we should expect to walk for a little over a week and that we would making stops to rest. The first day was really rough. It was very hot. I could feel the sun burning my skin. No matter how much water we drank, it seemed not to be enough. The guide would tell us not to drink too much water because it would slow us down if our bellies were too full. We walked for about 10 hours the first day before we stopped at another house to rest, clean ourselves, and eat. There were a bunch of guys at this house along with an older woman who cooked for us and gave us clean clothes to put on. The next few days were just about the same, except we didn't stop at a house. We slept outdoors. On about the 5th day, the man who was traveling with his wife and daughter got into an argument with one of the guides about money. The guide, who carried a weapon, pulled it out and shot the man. The man's wife and daughter were crying hysterically, and he told the woman that her husband deserved what happened to him. The guide said that the man had only given him enough money for 2 people instead of 3, and he wasn't in the business of smuggling people across the border for free. I remember my parents holding my brother and I tightly because we were so scared. My mother pulled out her rosary and began praying for this family. The guy who shot the man demanded my father give him more money or else the same thing would happen to him. My father gave him the money he demanded, and we continued the journey. For the rest of the time, I was so nervous, wondering what this man would do to me and my family. After 10 days, we finally made it to the US border, which we crossed during the middle of the night. The journey was rough, but we were very happy that it had come to an end. We crossed the border undetected and arrived in a Texas town that looked very similar to the other side of the border. I felt like I was still in Mexico, actually, and we didn't see any bright lights and tall buildings the way we did on the TV. We stayed at another house for a few days until we were forced onto the street to fend for ourselves. Eventually, my father got a job as a laborer and my mother as a seamstress. My brother and I were enrolled in school and very happy that we weren't the only ones in our class who didn't speak English. Since coming to the US, we have heard so many horror stories about people who cross the border and are harmed by the cartel because they didn't pay. It reminds us that we could have easily fallen victim like the man who was murdered in front of us. Crossing the border the way we did, and I pray for everyone who decides to do it knowing the potential danger.
This story was sent to us from Yesenia in California. This story happened to me about 10 years ago when I was 14 years old. I was born in San Diego, but sent to live with my grandmother in Mexico when I was 3 years old. My mother had passed away, and my father had abandoned me and my mother when I was a baby. I lived with my grandmother in a small town not too far from the US border. As a child, my grandmother tried to shelter me from everything. She rarely let me out of her sight. When I was about 14, I went to a party with my cousin, who we will call Anna. I had to beg my grandmother to let me go to the party. I was so happy that she said yes, because this would be my first time going to a party without an adult. Anna and I arrived at the party, and there were a lot of other people in our age group there. Also there were some guys who were friends with the older brother of the birthday boy. One of the older guys kept looking at me and smiling. He was in his 20s. He approached me after about 30 minutes, telling me how beautiful I was. I was very shy and nervous because he was so old. I told him thank you and walked away. Before the party ended, he approached me again and asked for my phone number, and I told him that I didn't have a cell phone. While he was talking to me, a fight broke out at the party with some of the older guys, and he pulled out a knife and stabbed one of the guys. I was so scared. I stood there frozen. My cousin grabbed my hand, and we ran out of the party along with some of the other kids. We ran back to my grandmother's house, and when she asked how the party was, we told her it was good. I didn't want to tell her the truth because I was afraid she would never let me go out again. About 2 weeks after the party, my grandmother sent me to the store to buy something, and I saw the same guy from the party. He walked over to me smiling and said, "Hey, I got something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cell phone. I looked at it and he said, "Here, take it." I didn't want to take it, but he insisted, so I did. "Well, I don't have any money to pay for this," I told him. He laughed at me and said I could pay him in kisses. I was so grossed out, I reached out my hand to give him the phone, but he wouldn't take it. He walked out of the store and rode away on his motorbike. The store owner told me I needed to be careful with that guy. I walked out of the store, and before I could make it to my house, the phone rang and I answered. It was the same guy telling me how much he loved me and wanted to marry me. I told him I was only 14 and he told me age was just a number. When I finally made it home to my grandmother's house, he was standing there in front of the house. He just looked at me and smiled without saying a word, and then he left. He called me every day for the next week, saying the same thing and demanding that I go out with him. I decided to end it all by simply throwing the phone away. Throwing the phone away only made him more aggressive. He began showing up to my school, and I would see him standing outside of the classroom. When I would walk from school, he would always be right there watching me. One day my grandmother sent me to the store again, and I was so scared, I brought a small knife in my pocket. When I walked out of the store, he was standing right there, and he grabbed me and tried to pull me into a parked car. I reached into my pocket for the knife and stabbed his hand. He let me go, and I ran home. I was so scared, I broke down and told my grandmother everything. Later that day, he showed up at my house with a group of guys and told my grandmother that if I didn't marry him, she would never see me again. My grandmother was a brave lady, and she stood up to them and told them no. She recognized a few of the guys from the neighborhood and knew that they were a part of the cartel. They left our house when my dog Chico started barking at them, but one of them pointed his gun at Chico and I screamed. One day I came home from school and my grandma looked really sad. She told me that the guys came back and stole Chico. They told her that if she wanted to see Chico again, she would have to exchange me for him. We didn't know what to do, so we called the priest at our church, and he prayed with us. Before he left our house, he told my grandmother, "You have to get her far away from here. They are not going to stop until they have her." A week later, my grandmother called her best friend who lived in Texas. She asked her if I could stay with her for a few months until things calmed down. Her friend agreed, and I went to stay with her. I was so sad leaving my grandmother alone, especially when she would call and tell me the guys kept harassing her. Unfortunately, the stress was too much for my grandmother, and she ended up passing away from a heart attack. I couldn't even go to my grandmother's funeral because I was so scared about what might happen to me if I went back. Sometimes I remember how badly I wanted to go to that party and can't help but think about how different things would have been if I had just stayed home.